Hello, fellow Java developers. Welcome back to our starter course on Apache Camel. In this video, we'll learn how to set up camel routes by creating and running our own camel route. To do that, we will also create Maven Camel project and set up Camel Context. Let's begin. Here's what we'll build: a Java application that runs a camel route. The route will read files from one directory and write them to another directory. It is a simple route, but it will set foundation for later, when we build more complex camel routes. Now, there are some prerequisites to this series. To follow along, of course you'll need some basic understanding of Java, as Camel is Java-based. You should be comfortable writing Java programs and using Maven for builds. You'll also need JDK 17 or higher installed. You can use any IDE or no IDE at all. But I'll be using IntelliJ IDEA, so you might find it easier to follow along if you're using the same. Let's start with setting up a new Maven project. It can be generated with IntelliJ or created by Maven archetype generate command. Now, when we have our project created, let's add camel dependency. Dependency that we need is camel core. This core library pulls all that is necessary to start and run Camel Context, as well as some very basic components, including the camel file component that we'll need for our route. Basically, if we have standalone Camel application without Spring or Quarkus frameworks, we should always use this org Apache Camel core dependency. At the time of recording, the latest version is 4.8.1, so we're using it. But you can go to Apache Camel releases page or to Maven central page and look up the latest version. Camel also uses SLF4j library for logging, so it's our task to provide an implementation. Let's add a logback dependency. And when download is finished, we have our Camel project set up. For now, we don't need to do anything else in our POM XML. Now, on to creating a route itself. There are several ways to do it, but the most simple one is to create Java class. Let's call it example route. And then let's extend it from route builder, which is provided by Camel core library. As we see, the only method that we need to implement is configure method, which, as you can tell from its name, should configure our route. Inside the route builder, we can use methods like from to configure our routes, or in other words, we can use Java DSL. Now, we need to pass some string into our from method. How should we know what to write here? As we know from previous video, there is a documentation page that lists all available Camel components. We want to read from a file, so let's search for a file component. Here on the component documentation page, we can see URI format section. That's what we need to put into our from statement. We can also see options section. And here in endpoint options, we can see what options are available, but we don't need any of them for now. So let's copy the URI and paste it in our from statement. We will specify src main resources files as our input directory. And with that, our from statement is ready. Now let's move our files to another directory. For this, we'll use to statement. Again, we're using the same URI that we get from Camel documentation page, except this time we will specify another directory, for example, src main resources files output. And with that, our route is finished. Now, to run our route, we need to create and start Camel Context. As you remember from previous video, Camel Context starts and runs our routes, so there is no way of making our route work without it. So what we do is we're creating Camel Context. The default Camel Context class is made to be used in standalone Camel application, without Spring or Quarkus frameworks. Basically, it's the only Camel context that we can create with new and use right away. If we look into default Camel Context class, we can see that it implements auto-closable interface, so what we can do is we can use it with try with resources statement. Like that. Now, as we remember from previous video, we need to configure our Camel context. For now, all configuration that we need is adding our route. This is done with add routes method, which takes any route builder, and we should pass our example route that, as you remember, extends route builder into this add routes method. And that's it. Our Camel context is configured. Now we need to start it and pause our thread. You see, if our main thread finishes, this Camel context, which is started in separate thread, will also finish. So, to let our Camel context run for some time, we pause our main thread for 2 seconds. After our Camel context runs for this amount of time, we can stop it, and it is closed automatically when exiting this try with resources block. Let's check it out. For this, we need to create our test file in the directory we've specified in our camel route. Let's create a new file hello.txt and print some contents into it. And let's run our route. As we can see, our file hello.txt is moved to the specified directory. Let's look at the logs produced. As we can see, first camel context is started, then our consumer is started with our route, then it pulled our input directory where there was one file, and it was processed by moving it into output directory. And after that, our route is shut down, and then the context itself is shut down. Now, when we have our route working, let's add some things to get a grasp on several more Camel fundamentals. Let's start with logging contents of our file before writing it in another directory. We can do it like this by adding log processing step. As we remember from previous video, camel routes operate with messages, and camel messages have headers and body, so let's log them. To make log processing step display message contents, we can use so-called simple language, as you can see here. You can look up definition of simple language here on this documentation page. We will take a look at it later, but for now, just remember that in simple language you can get message body and headers using this $sign and curly braces. Now, if we run our route and put hello.txt back to our input directory, we can see here in the logs our log message. This is the contents of our file, and this is our headers. These headers are added by the file component, and they are not very interesting, so let's get back to our camel route. Now let's edit the behavior of our from endpoint by adding an endpoint option. Let's make it so that our file is not deleted from input directory after it is processed. For that, we need to get back to our component documentation. Here in the Endpoint Options section, we can see that there is an option that does exactly what we need. Let's look at its description. If true, the file is not moved or deleted in any way. That's what we've looked for. Along with the description, we can see option name, its type, and default value. And we can also see if it's for consumer or producer endpoints. As we can see, this option is for consumer endpoints, which means that we can only use it in our from statement. To use the option, we simply specify it in our consumer URI, like that. Now, if we again move our file to input directory and run our route, we can see that after the route is finished, our file stays here in the input directory and it is also moved into the output directory as specified in our route. So, in general, if you need to tweak a component behavior or add some credentials or authentication to the protocol, what you usually do is you go to this endpoint options and look for the option that does what is needed. Then you just need to look up its name, its possible values, and specify the desired option in your endpoint in URI parameters. Finally, let's say a few words on running your Camel routes with Spring framework. You see, with Spring framework, you don't need to write any of this. In fact, you don't need to touch Camel Context at all. It's fully managed by Spring framework. What you'll need to do though is add your route builder as a Spring bean, for example by marking it with a component annotation. Then it will be picked up by Spring and managed automatically. For now, this is all you need to run your Camel route with Spring, but in future videos we will look at running Camel with Spring and Spring Boot in more details. So, to sum things up, today we've created our first Camel route. To do that, we've created a new Maven project and then added Camel core and logback dependencies. After that, we've created our Camel route by writing a Java class that extends route builder and implementing its configure method. Then, to run our route, we've created and started a Camel context in our main method. And after checking that our route works, we've added log steps that queries message body and headers with a simple language. And finally, added an endpoint option so that file is not deleted from the input directory after it's processed. In the next video, we will look into endpoints in more detail. And with that, here's the end of our video on making your first Camel route. Thanks for joining. Be sure to like, subscribe and hit that bell icon. And if you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. I will answer to all of those. See you in the next video. Until then, happy coding!